All right, hey, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with our good friend Christopher Moore, who is back in town to talk about his brand new, hilarious send-up of hard-boiled America, film noir, called Razzmatazz, which is a sequel to his previous book, Noir. Hey, Chris, it's great to see you again.
Thanks. It's nice to be here at Poisoned Pen, the Poisoned Pen, promoting my book.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I just wanted to ask you a little bit. I love the book, and so much that is wonderful about this book is the language and the dialogue, and kind of channeling that, the slang of the time,
Right.
the rhythm of the speech. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of got into that? Was it watching a lot of films?
Well, I sort of constructed the nobody really talks like my guys talk in this book. A lot of it came from Damon Runyon books and stories, which were written from the 20s through the 40s, and they were about guys in Manhattan, and the
Guys and Dolls.
Guys and Dolls is
Sure.
the thing that people are aware of that Damon Runyon did. Although I just found out there was a Lucille Ball movie. I can't think, it's something Street, that came out in the early 1940s that was a Damon Runyon gig, and I need to see that now because it was in the Lucy movie with Lucy and Desi. Pardon me, sorry about that. And anyway, so that worked. All those guys talk in present tense, but they try to speak in an elevated manner, so they use adjectives they don't know the meaning of. And then I went through, the Bowery Boys and watched a ton of those, which started in 1933, I think, and with the Dead End Kids and Humphrey Bogart and Bogey movies and George Raft movies, Cagney movies. And so I just constructed this dialect sort of the way I did in my Shakespeare-based books, where it's not really Shakespearean or Elizabethan, but it sounds like it could be, because I think it's hilarious, and calling all the women dames and the guys mugs and stuff like that. So it's basically a constructed dialect for the purpose of comedy, but it came from a lot of different sources. Certainly more from film than it came from literature.
Yeah, and the tone, they have that staccato, hey, what's the big idea?
Right,
See?
right, exactly.
That sort of language.
Yeah, and in fact, the guy who does the audiobook, and much without my direction, when the first audiobook came out of Noir, he had sent me a message and he said, Eddie Shu is Chinese. He said, do you want him to have an accent? I said, I absolutely do not want him to have an accent. This guy is third generation American. He's slick. He works in a club. He's going to be, a fast talking tough guy. And when the audiobook came out, he's doing a Jimmy Cagney for Eddie Mushu's. And in this book, there's a kind of a mystery narrator, and it's Edward G. Robinson from those, and he sounds more like Edward G. Robinson from the old Bugs Bunny movies. And so really that's sort of the way that I hear these guys, is not so much as the George Raft movies and the Jimmy Cagney movies, but as the Bugs Bunny send-up of those things that all happens, contemporaneously with those movies and so forth. And it's just all for fun. It's great fun to write these people that talk this way, but I use the noir tropes, the Jim Thompson and James M. Cain tropes of, it's just normal working guys. They're not gangsters. They're not professional criminals. They're just guys holding down jobs. Yeah. And then some dame walks into their life and everything just goes bananas. And so that's what happens in noir, and sort of happens in this, is guys that are completely unprepared for doing what they're thrown into, and yet they're game,
And there's always that, okay, once I make this final score,
right,
I'm going to get out of the business.
Right.
Everything's going to be great.
Right. And my guys are so desperate in this, like the main character, Sammy, he just wants to be able to get his girlfriend a phone so he doesn't have to go up 387 steps of Telegraph Hill to tell her something.
Right.
So they're really right at the edge of one paycheck from homeless, and it's fun to write characters like that. I've been there, so I know what it's like.
Right. And as far as, that kind of salacious, definitely not politically correct world that we're talking about.
Right.
You go back and you look at some of the old, the pulp stories and the pulp magazines of the era, and some of those, absolutely racist.
Right.
The inscrutable Asian is always the villain, and stuff like that. Were the pulps at all kind of an influence?
I think a little bit. I think a little bit, and I think that. And I send them up a little bit.
Yeah.
Sammy at one time says to to Mushu's, who is the nickname he gives to Eddie Shu because he wears like those Holstein covered wingtips. Colored wingtips, and he says, "Don't play that inscrutable Asian thing with me. I can scroot the hell out of you. I can scroot you 5 days a week, you know." And so they're playing on that fact. And there are a few characters in there. Uncle Ho, who ran an opium den in the first book, we get his backstory in this one. And we find out how he came to America, and he wasn't always sort of the opium pipe smoking, inscrutable old Chinese guy with a wispy beard. He at one point was a young man trying to make his way in the world, and we see him in that period in the early 1900s. So yeah, I play on those tropes, and then I sort of blow up those tropes and have fun with them. And it's a delicate balance because you're dealing with things like human trafficking.
Right.
And trying to write a comedy that's like does a little light human trafficking is tough, but so far I think it works.
Right. And then I mean, and you're looking at an America that tends to be almost whitewashed these days or forgotten by,
right,
in some ways, at least the sensibilities
right.
of the time.
Yeah, and I didn't want to gloss over that.
Right.
It's just sort of accepted.
Yep.
But I also, you know, the way the characters talk is not politically correct because they're talking in context. The narrators even are not in context. Some of the stereotype jokes are not in context. Some of the stereotypes are stereotypes because they are true and acknowledged by the group that they're talking about. But you know, there's African American characters in this book who can't get a cab and aren't allowed to work in certain areas and can't get a drink at the bar at the club that they work at.
Right.
And I don't dwell on that. It just happens to be the world that these people live in. You know? And a lot of, in this particular one, a lot of interaction with the Chinese characters from different generations, from Chinese characters that have never been to China to guys who were Tong warriors and came over and were basically like indentured servants, you know, in 1900, and I go into the history of the earthquake and stuff like that. So it's fun, and the whole thing, as with any of my books, is if it's not fun, it doesn't work.
Right.
But I always feel like you need to have a canvas to paint the fun on, and that involves research and sort of reflecting a bit what was real at the time. Now,
San Francisco, you know, is definitely a quintessential noir city in a lot of ways.
Right.
You know, Dashiell Hammett, of course. And, can you talk just a little bit about that? You know, about the city itself, which is definitely a character in this book.
Well, you know, visually it's a gorgeous city. Yeah. But when nighttime falls and you've got, you know, neighborhoods like North Beach, which is the Italian neighborhood, and right next to it is Chinatown. You know, the neon and the fog and the neon dragons and the Italian flags and all that stuff is so pronounced and so part of it, even to this day, 100 years from when all that stuff was established. And it's just a great atmosphere for stuff to have happen, you know, and at the time, the clash of cultures, you know, not to get too in the weeds because we want to talk about the fun stuff, but you know, the African American population of San Francisco went up by 700% during World War II because of the workers coming from the South to work in the shipyards. The Japantown filled. Everybody was sent out to internment camps, and the African American workers that came from the South to work in the shipyards moved into Japantown. So when the Japanese people came back after the war, there were jazz clubs all around, and so suddenly you had these, you know, people who were kind of traditionally Japanese American, and they were exposed to jazz, and it became part of their culture. And those things are interesting to me. The Chinese Exclusion Act was suddenly repealed in the middle of World War II because they went, oh my God, these guys are our allies. Yeah. You know, because the Japanese attacked China before they attacked us. Exactly. And so there were fundraisers in Chinatown by the greater Anglo population for the Chinese, you know, so these people that had been sort of secondhand citizens and it wasn't even legal to be Chinese, basically. That suddenly was like, oh, these are our friends. And then there was a little bit of Orientalism, which is something that, you know, sort of raises its head in England in the late 1800s, and then also you get it in San Francisco in the 1930s and 40s, where you have these clubs, like in the book, Club Shanghai, where you have Chinese characters dressed as Anglo performers. So they're doing Frank Sinatra and Andrews Sisters and all these acts, and people from Nob Hill and Pacific Heights come, and it's sort of their way of slumming and going to a speakeasy and having this experience. And that's before you even get to the drag clubs, which were huge in post-World War II, and both drag king clubs and drag queen clubs. And these books sort of focus more on the drag king clubs because more people don't know about those.
Yeah.
And they're interesting, you know. And the underlying thread through Razzmatazz is somebody's murdering the drag kings of San Francisco. And of course, one of the people, Jimmy Vasco, who is this dame that owns one of the drag king clubs, wants Sammy Tiffin, who's our main character, to solve that murder, even though he's a bartender in North Beach, because everybody thinks he whacked the last head of vice and made and allowed fun to come back to San Francisco. So that's the plot. I don't want to get more of it than that, but it goes into that subculture too. So the whole book is just this clashing of all these different sort of subcultures, and the characters having fun with that too, and teasing each other.
It is an absolute blast. Was there a particular voice that started speaking to you first when you were coming up with this world?
I can't think that there's a singular voice that came to me other than, as I said, the Damon Runyon stories.
Yeah.
You know, they're always told first person, and it's always in present tense, and it's always grammatically a disaster. And I think hearing that voice, where the narrator is trying to sort of dignify the low down things that he and his friends are doing with big words and so forth, I think that may have overarched what was going on, and they're all trying to be a little tougher and a little more savvy than they really are, but basically the main four friends that are the crux of the book, particularly this book, they're all good-hearted guys, and they take care, they watch each other's back and so forth, even though, you know, one is, you know, a soldier with PTSD from being blown up in the war, and one didn't make it to the war because he was injured and had to work in a shipyard and kind of ran away from home because he didn't want to be called a coward. And then this enormous African American guy who came with his mama to work in the shipyards from Alabama, and then Eddie Mushoes, who's a hustler who works in a club and is a doorman at one of these Anglo Chinese clubs. And he's just a sharp operator, but because he is a sharp operator, his traditional Chinese family doesn't want anything to do with him. So that's the main core. And then of course there's Stilton, who was a Wendy the Welder, which is the shipyard version of Rosie the Riveter, who worked in airplane things. And she and her buddy Myrtle worked in the defense industry. And when the war was over, it was like, okay, now you dames just go back and make a house. You know, go have babies, and they're not about to go do that.
Right.
So they're working at a lunch counter at like a Woolworths, but they have secret projects going on using their welding skills from when they were in the shipyard and stuff. So I just think it's an interesting time.
It's so fascinating. You know, in this particular book, and then we'll wrap it up. This particular book takes place in '47.
Right.
You know, just post-war, obviously.
Right.
And so you have, you know, millions of veterans coming home.
Right.
You know, from many of whom from the horrors of what they've just seen in the war, and you know, they are looking for adult entertainment.
Yeah.
You know, in the films and in the books they read.
Right.
And that there's that whole notion of this sort of world that's just lost its innocence. You know, and that definitely is kind of under the surface here in the book.
Well, and one thing, I don't know if it's so much, it's sort of a minor subplot, but one of the things that happened too was the women whose husbands went off to be officers, they couldn't go anywhere to be safe because there were sailors and soldiers in town getting ready to be shipped out, and they were out on the town trying to have a good time and so forth. And so they actually went to lesbian bars because it was the only place they could go to not be hit on. And they became sort of part of that culture, not necessarily changing their sexual orientation, but they were accepted into it. You know, it was a place you could go and hang out and have a drink and listen to some music, and there wouldn't be a bunch of soldiers and sailors hitting on you.
Right.
And so that's kind of part of it too. But it's rich, and it's rich with a lot of material of cultures clashing. One of the sources for the book, and then I'll wrap it up, was Iffy Hollers by
Chester Himes.
What's his last name?
Chester Himes.
Yeah, for Chester Himes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the dialect, in order to get the African American dialect right, that's where I got it from, which was Chester Himes wrote a book, Iffy Hollers, which is about shipwelders in the Los Angeles shipyards during World War II.
He was so brilliant.
Yeah, he really was, it's really a lens onto the African American culture at that time.
Yeah.
It's not part of the Harlem Renaissance, but part of the World War II and 1940s.
And then he goes on to do those Harlem domestic series,
Right,
with Coffin
right.
Ed and Gravedigger Jones, which
Right.
Beautiful
great
books.
Great books. But
Yeah.
the one for me, because it was on the West Coast that was relevant, was Iffy Hollers, and I went, okay, this is a real thing. I'm not making this up. In the first book, you have Sammy, who is running away from his injury. He gets put on an all-black welding crew because he's a smartass, and they're trying to punish him, and that's how he befriends Thelonious Jones, Lone Jones, and they remain friends after the war. So it sort of builds through things that I had a little bit of basis of. Yeah, that could happen. It wasn't just grabbing Bugs Bunny cartoons and going, yeah, that happened because I saw it. Daffy Duck did it.
Yeah, I mean, you look and you read, James Ellroy, who has that stylized language, but he's writing about a world that isn't too far behind us right now.
No, that's true. And I read his books about the big homeless guy whose name eludes me right now, Hercules something, or I can't remember. He did a series of like 2 or 3 books about this character, and I'm sorry, I've been on book tour, and Elroy did.
Okay.
But anyway,
L.A. Confidential, of course, and Black Dahlia.
Oh, not Elroy. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Devil in a Black Dress guy.
Oh, Walter Mosley.
Walter Mosley.
Yeah,
that's
those are
what
great
I'm thinking
too.
about. Yeah, that's who I'm thinking about. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, Elroy is so dark. I can't.
I know.
I'm writing comedy here. I can't get that deep.
Yeah. I know this book is just out. Are you going to be kind of dipping back into this world in the future, you think? Do you have any plans?
I don't know. I like writing it.
Yeah.
I really do. So I think that now I've done enough of reflecting the world that if I did another one, it would have to be really a straight crime caper kind of thing.
You get into 50s.
I don't know how far it has to move forward. This one is only 6 months after Noir.
That's true, yeah.
But if I have an idea, I'll do it, because I do like writing it, and I like it because of the language, because I have a problem with the language. So yeah, it could happen, but I didn't plan most of the sequels I've written, so who knows?
Well, you could add an element of vampires into this world, which would be an absolute blast, wouldn't it?
Well, there may or may not be a dragon in this one.
Yeah.
No spoilers.
That's right. Well, Chris, always wonderful to see you. Readers, you're in for an absolute treat with Razzmatazz. And thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.